What is the role of religion in our ever-changing world? From the NewsChannel 5 network, this is Issues of Faith.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to Issues of Faith. Glad you are with us. Everyone is saying at every corner that these are unprecedented times, and in many ways, of course, it is. Churches are now worshiping virtually because it is not safe to have large numbers of people gather together. And when I heard that, I thought it was truly unprecedented. But I read an article, How Churches of Christ, and all churches, responded when the 1918 Spanish flu killed millions. And the fact is, we've gone through a lot of this before. Churches responding by social distancing, closing worship, and doing some other remarkable things. And I think we can learn a lot from what we've done before, and I'm very happy to have with us the writer of that article, Dr. John Mark Hicks. He is a professor of theology at the Hayslip School of Theology at Lipscomb University, and he joins us via Zoom, which they didn't do back in 1918. But Dr. Hicks, thank you for being here.
I'm glad to be here. Grateful for the invitation.
All right, so you started looking into this a couple of weeks ago, and what did you find?
Well, I knew about the Spanish influenza, and I also knew something about Churches of Christ. It's in Nashville. It's a research interest of mine. So I thought I would start looking around and digging around in the periodicals and the newspapers and find out what happened here in Nashville during the Spanish influenza. And that's when I focused on Churches of Christ, because that's my background and my tradition. And I found that what we were talking about is unprecedented today was not unprecedented at all. In fact, we're following the same playbook, you might say, with social distancing, with shutting down public gatherings, including church services. That has happened before, all across the country, not just here in Nashville.
And I was surprised to see that, but churches did the right thing. I mean, the government said this is what you need to do, and then churches responded. When I heard 3 weeks ago churches were going to shut down, I was shocked, like it had never happened. But it has happened. And so as you look back, what are some specific churches that kind of stand out here in the Nashville area through your research?
Well, there's a couple that stand out. The First Presbyterian Church and the Russell Street Church of Christ both became hospitals. In fact, the Russell Street Church of Christ, upon hearing the order and seeing the overcrowding at the hospitals going on in town, the Russell Street Church approached the Red Cross and asked them if they needed help. Did they need space? And so did the Presbyterian Church. And the result was that both of those churches became hospitals, temporary hospitals. And I know a couple of churches helped them with that, like the 11th Street Church of Christ and the Chapel Avenue Church of Christ. Both supplied resources and people and nursing. They would get in their cars and go get the sick out of their house, the poor who couldn't pay for a hospital. So, for example, the Russell Street Church of Christ ministered particularly to the poor. And they would go find the people who couldn't get into the hospital, who couldn't pay for the hospital, and they would bring them to the Russell Street Church of Christ, where they would nurse them and feed them and care for them. And several churches contributed money and resources and people and transportation to affect that outcome. So it was an amazing coming together in that particular church, with a few other congregations helping that addressed the epidemic head on.
And so so as you hear that, when you start talking about that epidemic, I've heard about the Spanish flu, but I don't think it had registered with me how big a deal it was. And I'm sure as you did this research, it really registered with you. But take us back, how big a deal was the Spanish flu of 1918? And wasn't it a 2-year thing?
It was huge. It started in 1917 when some soldiers out of Kansas went over to France, and then it spread to France and Spain, and then it came back. And it came back in September, earlier than that, but one of the major outbreaks happened when some sailors came back to Boston, and then they went to Philadelphia. And in Philadelphia, the flu broke out in the barracks, and they couldn't contain it. It spread out into the population. And instead of doing social distancing, Philadelphia continued with business as normal. They had, in fact, a huge bond parade. They were trying to reach their bond level, right? The government has given cities a certain level they should raise money for the war effort. And Philadelphia hadn't got there yet, so they needed that day to reach their bond level, and the mayor refused to cancel the parade. And so you have thousands of people mingling in the streets, and within 2 days, 3 days, the hospitals were full. And within 2 days, 113 people were dead. Within 3 days, 500 people were dead because they didn't do social distancing, which is in contrast to St. Louis. St. Louis did social distancing right off, and their death levels were much lower. So when it came to Nashville, late September, and I think it hit its peak in late October, but about midway through October, the state health board said, shut everything down, shut the businesses down, shut the churches down. All public gatherings are banned. And the churches cooperated. There were 92 churches here in Nashville, and all of them closed their doors.
That's great. So they had seen what had happened in other parts of the country, right? I mean, they knew at that point it was a big deal.
Yeah, they were aware, and they were aware that this was effective, or at least it had been effective in other pandemics or epidemics previously. You know, epidemics are not a new thing. Nashville's been through a yellow fever epidemic. It's been through a cholera epidemic, and then it hit the big epidemic with the Spanish flu, which took about, if I remember right, like 2% of the population, or maybe it was 1% of the population in Nashville died in that influenza.
Wow. Yeah, it's a large number, and we don't even know for sure the numbers because I think there were some issues with how things were counted, but it was a major. Well, go ahead.
Yeah, globally, they think maybe 50 million people died from that influenza. But we don't know the numbers.
What stands out to you? What can we learn today from what happened back then? As you have researched this, as you have researched the role of churches, what can we learn about the response back then?
Well, a couple of things. One is the church there were two different responses. There were some churches that objected to closing their services. Not in Nashville. I haven't found anybody in Nashville objecting to that, but in other places they did object. But they complied ultimately. But I think one of the main things we want to learn from this is that this, in terms of the Christian faith, is an opportunity to express our love of neighbor. That when we love our neighbors, that has priority. And loving our neighbors involves social distancing in epidemic context or pan-epidemic context. If we're going to care about our neighbor, to care about their health and to care about their life, then we love them in a way that shows mercy rather than ritual. And I think the principle of Jesus that I desire mercy, not sacrifice, comes into play here. I desire mercy, not sacrifice. It's more important to show mercy. It's more important to love your neighbor. It's more important to social distance and to shut down your services because of the spread of the virus than it is to engage the ritual. Now, I believe the ritual is important. It's very important to me. And I love the ritual. I love gathering with people and worshiping. And that's really important to me because I think it is a moment when we encounter God together. But loving neighbor is more important than burnt offerings and sacrifice. And so what we need to hear, and what I heard in the historical record, was that same argument going on. That, for example, an MC Curfews from Louisville, Kentucky, basically said, look, we're going to meet in homes, as they did in the times of the apostles, he says. We're going to meet in homes so we can show kindness and love to the people around us. This is not about serving God or closing doors, right? This is about closing doors in order to serve God. This is closing our services in order to love our neighbor. So we don't really close the church. The church actually breaks out of its boundaries. We don't close the church, we close the services. So as I said, I think in the article, that when Russell Street, it didn't close its doors, it opened them to ministry, it opened them to service, it opened them to helping people. And I think that's the pivot churches need, to pivot away from the anger or the disruption of the services or the vitriol against the government, to pivot from that to a orientation to neighbor that says, I'm going to love you this way. This is the best way I can love you right now, by social distancing. And we'll find other ways to connect, whether it's in home groups or whether it's in our context, through online, Zoom, Google Hangout, whatever it is, whatever platform we might use to connect with each other.
On some level, you're saying this is a real opportunity for the church. And I love that. And all right, I want to take a break. And I want to ask, when we come back, all right, you have through the lens of history, you can see what happened to churches after everything settled down in 1918. I think some people are worried, shutting down worship services, people will drift away, that kind of thing. So we'll talk about what happened after. Take a break, be back right after this.